The Gilgo Beach Murders. In December 2010, a police officer and his cadaver dog were searching a remote stretch of Ocean Parkway on Long Island. They were looking for one missing woman. It seemed like a routine search. But hidden behind the thick brush along the roadside was a secret no one expected to find. Within hours, investigators would uncover evidence pointing not to one victim, but to something far more disturbing. What began as a search for answers would soon expose one of the most disturbing cold cases in New York's history. As the search for one of New York's missing sex worker, Shannon Gilbert, continued, he saw human remains, wrapped in burlap, half buried in the undergrowth afterwards. Then, a few 100 feet away, more. And more after that. Within months, this single 3-mile corridor of highway brush will give up the partial remains of at least 10 different people. Some dismembered. Some scattered across multiple sites, miles apart, as if assembled from a kit. Almost all of them concealed with the same careful, practiced indifference, like someone who had done this before, and would do it again. No suspect. No name. No idea, yet how many more are out there, or how long this has been going on. It will take investigators 13 years to answer that question. And when they finally do, the answer will be almost impossible to believe. The man responsible spent those 13 years living 15 miles away, going to work, coming home to his wife, and when no one was looking, searching the internet under a fake name to read about his own crimes. This is the story of the Gilgo Beach killings. Before there was a suspect, before there was even a working theory, there were just the remains, and the slow, grim work of trying to figure out who they had been. 4 of the victims found along Ocean Parkway would eventually become known publicly as the Gilgo 4, women whose disappearances, years earlier, had barely registered as news at all. Maureen Brainerd Barnes, 25. Melissa Barthélemy, 24. Megan Waterman, 22. Amber Lynn Costello, 27. All of them did sex work to get by. Some of them were mothers. All of them had been missing for years before anyone connected their disappearances to each other, let alone to a single killer. And that detail, who they were, turned out to matter enormously in the worst way. For years, families and advocates argued that the disappearances of these women were treated, by the system meant to protect them, as lower priority. Less urgent. Less worth the resources. The victims' families, when asked, never disagreed. Other remains found at the same site stayed unidentified far longer. One woman lay in evidence storage for nearly 30 years under the case name Fire Island Jane Doe, before genetic genealogy finally gave her a name. Karen Vergata, 34, a Manhattan mother who had vanished in 1996. Others, found among the same scattered remains, still don't have names at all. More on that later. What investigators did have, from early on, was biological evidence. Male hair, recovered from the burlap wrapped around several of the victims' remains. They ran it. Nothing. No match in any database, no name, no face. Just a file that got heavier every year and never got closer to closed. The case went cold. Genuinely cold, the kind of cold where you have evidence sitting right there and still can't move an inch. In 2022, 12 years after the first remains were found, Suffolk County did something that should have happened a decade earlier. They built a dedicated, multi-agency task force with one job: start over. Rebuild the entire case from the ground up, using investigators and forensic methods that hadn't existed when the bodies were first found. They started with a truck. Buried in the original case file was a witness account from 2010, someone who remembered seeing a distinctive pickup truck near the area around the time Amber Costello vanished. It had sat in the file for over a decade, one data point among thousands, never run down. The new task force ran it through vehicle registration records. It matched a Chevrolet Avalanche, registered to a man named Rex Heuermann, of Massapequa Park. That name had actually surfaced once before, years earlier, flagged briefly and dismissed. This time, investigators didn't let it go. They started building a life around it, quietly, without him knowing. And what they found stopped looking like a coincidence almost immediately. This is the part of the story that's genuinely hard to sit with. As surveillance deepened, Prosecutors say investigators discovered Heuermann had built an entire second identity online. He'd registered burner phones and a Tinder account under fake names, Andrew Roberts, Thomas Hawk, and used them, according to court filings, to contact sex workers hundreds of times across the years his crimes spanned. Phone records allegedly tied those same burner numbers to the calls that arranged meetings with 3 of the Gilgo 4 victims, and, more chilling, to a taunting phone call made to Melissa Barthelemy's teenage sister after Barthelemy disappeared, and to calls checking Maureen Brainerd Barnes's voicemail after she went missing. But it's his search history that really tells you what you're dealing with. Investigators say one of his burner accounts ran thousands of searches for violent, sadistic adult content. And, separately, that same account ran over 200 searches, between March 2022 and June 2023, for the Gilgo Beach investigation itself. News coverage, documentaries, podcasts, theories about the case. He was monitoring his own manhunt in real time, from a burner email registered under a fake name, while living 15 miles away under his real one. 2 men, as far as the internet was concerned. 1 man, eating pizza on Fifth Avenue and driving home to Massapequa Park every night to sleep next to his wife. By early 2023, investigators had circumstantial evidence stacking up: the truck, the burner phones, the searches. What they didn't have was DNA they could legally use. You can't compel a cheek swab from someone who isn't formally a suspect yet. You need something he throws away voluntarily. Trash, in the eyes of the law, belongs to no one. So they watched. And they waited for him to give it to them. In early 2023, a surveillance team tailed Heuermann near his Fifth Avenue office. They watched him finish lunch. They watched him walk to a public trash can and drop in a pizza box, crust still inside. He didn't look back. Why would he? Investigators recovered the box and rushed it to the Suffolk County Crime Lab. A swab was pulled from the leftover pizza crust. It was compared against the male hair recovered from the burlap wrapped around victim Megan Waterman, back in 2010. The mitochondrial DNA profile matched, a profile shared by less than 0.04% of the North American population. On July 13, 2023, Rex Heuermann was arrested outside his Manhattan office. His attorney later told reporters the only thing his client said, through tears, was, "I didn't do this." He had. He just hadn't said it yet. The arrest wasn't the end. It was the start of 3 more years of a case getting steadily, methodically heavier. Over the following months, additional charges were filed as investigators connected him to more of the remains found along Ocean Parkway. 3 murders charged in July 2023, a 4th added in January 2024, 2 more that June, another that December. 7 counts in total, spanning crimes from 1993 to 2010. And there was an 8th. Karen Vergata, a 34-year-old Manhattan woman who'd gone missing in 1996, whose partial remains had sat unidentified for almost 30 years under the case name Fire Island Jane Doe. In 2023, just weeks after Heuermann's arrest, genetic genealogy finally gave her back her name. Heuermann was never formally charged in her death, but in court, he would eventually admit to killing her too. His lawyers fought the DNA evidence for nearly 3 years, all the way up until a judge ruled it admissible at trial in September 2025. A trial date was set for that September. It never happened. On April 8, 2026, Rex Heuermann stood in a Riverhead, New York courtroom and changed his plea to guilty to 7 murders, with the 8th, Karen Vergata's, admitted but uncharged. When the judge asked him, in open court, how he had assaulted his victims, Heuermann answered with a single word: strangulation. Witnesses said he showed almost nothing. The same flat, unreadable expression he'd worn through nearly 3 years of hearings. Then, on June 17, 2026, he stood in that same courtroom again, this time for sentencing. 13 family members of his victims were there to face him. When Heuermann indicated he wished to speak, the judge told him to stand. He had almost nothing to say. "There are no words I can say. I am responsible for what was said in this room today. The words I would say have no meaning and I'm going to leave it there at this time." The judge, Timothy Motzi, asked him directly, "Are you a little bit sorry for what you did for these poor innocent missing women? Are you at least a little bit sorry for that?" And he said, "Yes, I am," in his response to the judge. The judge sentenced him to serve the rest of his without the possibility of parole. One of the victim's sister, Jessica Taylor, stood and told him to his face not to forget what he said to her on the phone call he made to her sister's phone. As a 15-year-old, she had once received a taunting phone call from this man, told him simply that she hoped he would suffer. Sandra Costilla's sister told the court she found comfort in knowing her sibling's killer would spend the rest of his life in prison. Heuermann was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without parole, followed by 4 consecutive terms of 25 years to life, a sentence that, on paper, outlasts the idea of release by centuries. As part of his plea, he agreed to cooperate with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit to help identify other serial killers still operating. When the sentence was read, the judge ordered him removed from the courtroom. Family members broke into applause, some chanting a single word at him as he was led out in cuffs. "Ogre! Ogre!" His now ex-wife, Asa Ellerup, who filed for divorce after his arrest, was outside the courthouse. She kept her statement brief. Her thoughts were with the victims, and she asked for privacy for her family. She has never been charged with anything. Investigators say her own DNA, found on hairs recovered from 2 of the victims, was almost certainly transferred there, unknowingly, from her husband's clothing. Here's the thing about this case that should unsettle you more than anything else in it. Rex Heuermann's 8 victims all eventually got their names back. Even Karen Vergata, after nearly 30 years as Fire Island Jane Doe, was finally identified. Not everyone is so lucky. And not every cold case has an ending. Mary Theresa Simpson. Mary Theresa Simpson was 12 years old. She was small and quiet and wore cat-eye glasses, those swooping, fashionable frames of the era. And she was, by all accounts, the kind of child who was most fully herself at home, with the people she loved. On the evening of Sunday, March 15, 1964, Mary Theresa had spent the afternoon at her grandfather's house on Sierra Street, playing with her cousins the way 12-year-olds play, loudly, carelessly, with no sense that the afternoon has a bottom until suddenly it does. It was around 6:30 in the evening. Late winter dark was already settling. She was heading home from her grandfather's house near the corner of East Market Street and Harriet Street, a walk she had made before, through streets she knew, in a city that she had no reason to be afraid of. She never arrived. When Mary Theresa didn't come home, her father Ellsworth reported her missing that same night. The Elmira Police Department launched a search. Neighbors joined. Family members covered the streets on foot. People who didn't know the Simpsons personally showed up because they had daughters of their own, or sisters of their own, or because the search for a missing 12-year-old in March darkness is the kind of thing you don't stay home for. 4 days passed. On March 19, 1964, a man hiking in a wooded area off Combs Hill Road in the town of Southport, approximately 5 miles from where Mary was last seen alive, made a discovery that would mark him for the rest of his life. He was hiking with his sons. They found a pile of large rocks and branches and dirt that didn't look like it belonged where it was. That looked like it had been placed. Underneath the rocks, underneath the sticks, underneath the dirt, they found Mary Theresa Simpson. She was still fully clothed, which is one of the few details about the discovery that offered any mercy. She had been sexually assaulted. And in the detail that would haunt this case for 61 years, a detail so specific, so deliberate, that it speaks to something both brutal and unknowable about the man who did it. Her mouth had been stuffed with twigs and dirt. She was 12 years old. She had been carried 5 miles from where someone had taken her from the street, and hidden under stones, and left as if she had never existed. But she had existed. She was Mary Theresa. She roller skated with her sister on the sidewalks of Elmira. And the sister who had been 16 when Mary disappeared would spend the next 61 years carrying the question of who had done this. Linda rushed home when she heard of her sisters. She had been out of town. She came back to find her little sister in a casket. "I couldn't believe she was in a casket," she would say in 2026. "I tried to jump in it. I wanted to be in there with her." The Elmira Police Department investigated intensively throughout the spring of 1964. Detectives conducted hundreds of interviews. They canvassed every street Mary might have walked. They spoke to her teachers, her classmates, her neighbors, anyone who might have seen anything on the evening of March 15th. They built timelines. They followed leads. But in 1964, investigators had none of the tools that would eventually solve this case. There were no DNA databases. There were no forensic genealogy techniques. There was no technology for analyzing biological evidence in any way that could connect it to a specific individual. What investigators had was paper and telephones and shoe leather and the collective memory of a community in shock. And what they had, crucially, was discipline. Every item recovered from the scene around Mary's body was catalogued, preserved, and stored. Her skirt. Her glasses. A fan club card found near the scene. The biological material, the evidence of the sexual assault, was collected into an evidence bag, labeled, and placed in storage in the Elmira Police Department's property room. Nobody in 1964 understood why this would matter. There was no science to apply to it. But somebody with good institutional instincts decided that evidence didn't get thrown away, and that decision, that one act of methodical care, would set in motion a chain of events that would close this case 6 decades later. The case went cold. No suspects were charged. No arrests were made. By the end of 1964, the murder of Mary Theresa Simpson had officially entered the limbo that law enforcement calls a cold case. The file stayed open. The evidence stayed boxed. The questions stayed unanswered. For 39 years. In 2003, in the earliest days of what would become a revolution in forensic science, investigators submitted the biological evidence from Mary's case to CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, the national criminal DNA database maintained by the FBI. The technology was new. The submission was hopeful. No match. 11 years later, in 2014, the sample was resubmitted. The database had grown by millions of profiles. Investigators waited for the algorithm to return a hit. Still nothing. The man responsible had never been in the criminal system in a way that required his DNA. He had never been caught for anything serious enough to compel a biological sample. And so while his DNA sat, metaphorically, in an evidence bag in an Elmira property room, and while his actual living body went about its life in the same city as Mary Theresa Simpson's family, the database had no way to make the connection. In 2022, Sergeant William Goodwin of the Elmira Police Department was assigned to the Simpson case and received something that would change the investigation forever. A grant from an organization called Season of Justice, a non-profit dedicated to funding cold case investigations. The grant gave Goodwin the resources to pursue something his predecessors had not been able to afford. He contacted Othram. Othram is a private forensic genomics laboratory in the Woodlands, Texas, founded specifically to do what every other DNA lab had failed to accomplish in the Simpson case: extract a usable investigative profile from a sample that was too degraded, too small, or too old for conventional testing. Othram's scientists looked at the biological evidence from Mary's skirt. It amounted to 0.4 nanograms of DNA, an amount so small it is genuinely invisible to the naked eye. An amount that any standard laboratory would have declared insufficient. Othram said they could work with it. But the sample had to get to Texas first. And in 2024, FBI Special Agent Kenneth Jensen, who had been assigned to assist the Simpson investigation, packaged the evidence with extreme care: dry ice, insulated cooler, expedited FedEx shipment, and sent it to Othram's lab. Then a historic winter ice storm paralyzed the city of Memphis, Tennessee, home to the largest FedEx distribution hub in the world. The hub went dark. Flights were grounded. Thousands of packages sat stranded in a freezing, inaccessible warehouse as temperatures outside, and eventually inside, plummeted. Jensen was on the phone and couldn't reach anyone. His cooler, containing the only viable DNA sample from the 60-year-old murder of a 12-year-old girl, was sitting in that warehouse while the dry ice that kept the biological material stable slowly sublimated. If the temperature inside that cooler rose too far, the DNA would degrade. Permanently. Irreversibly. The case would be over. I was petrified, Jensen would later say, that my act of shipping it through FedEx was going to lose the only chance of solving it. He made a call to his FBI contacts in Memphis, specifically a bureau liaison with facility access. That agent entered the frozen warehouse and began what Sergeant Goodwin later called a massive scavenger hunt, looking for a single cooler among thousands of stranded packages in a massive, barely accessible building in the middle of an ice storm. He found it. Just before the dry ice ran out. He moved it to the FBI's local facility freezer, where the sample remained stable until the storm broke and shipping could resume. The cooler reached Othram. Othram's scientists performed forensic-grade genome sequencing on the 0.4 nanogram sample. They extracted a complete enough genetic profile to build what investigators call an SNP profile, a single nucleotide polymorphism profile, the kind of detailed genetic fingerprint that can be compared against consumer genealogy databases to find biological relatives. The FBI's forensic genetic genealogy team uploaded the profile, and they began to build a family tree. Branch by branch, relative by relative, cross-referencing birth records, census data, marriage certificates, obituaries, working backward through generations and forward through family lines until the branches of the tree converged on a man who had been born in Elmira, had lived in Elmira his entire life, and had died in Elmira in 2004. Alfred Raymond Murray, Jr. By 2025, investigators had enough genealogical evidence to be confident in the identification. Then they went further. They located Murray's son, a living relative whose DNA could confirm the familial connection. His son provided a sample. It matched the profile from Mary's skirt. Now they needed Murray's own DNA, which meant opening his grave. In November 2025, in a cemetery in Elmira, investigators exhumed the remains of Alfred Raymond Murray, Jr. A forensic anthropologist was present. DNA was extracted from what remained of the man who had been dead for 21 years. That DNA was compared to the biological material preserved from Mary Theresa Simpson's skirt since 1964. The probability of a DNA profile belonging to anyone other than Murray, less than 1 in 320 billion. On February 10, 2026, Elmira Police Chief Kristen Thorne stood at a podium surrounded by investigators from multiple agencies, by representatives from the FBI and the Chemung County District Attorney's Office, and by the family of Mary Theresa Simpson. "This is a historic day for the Elmira Police Department," she said. "Justice, after 61 years." Linda Galpin, the 16-year-old who had tried to climb into her sister's casket in 1964, was 78 years old when she heard those words. "I always said it would never happen in my lifetime," she said afterward. Her voice, by all accounts of those who were there, was steady. "I was wrong." Alfred Murray had no known connection to the Simpson family. He had targeted Mary Theresa, if that is even the right word for what appears to have been an act of predatory opportunism, as a stranger. A 12-year-old girl on a familiar street on an ordinary evening who happened to be in his path. Now she is a case that made New York history, the oldest cold case in the state ever solved through forensic genetic genealogy. Barbara Waldman. Barbara Waldman was 31 years old. She was, by every account of the people who knew her, exactly the kind of person who made a neighborhood better by being in it. She was a graduate of New York University, a credential that, for a woman building a life in 1974, carried real weight, real earned distinction. She had long blonde hair. She was active in the local Oceanside Cancer Society, the kind of community involvement that comes from believing your presence in a place creates an obligation to make it a little better. She was funny, by accounts, warm, the kind of person who remembered the details of other people's lives and asked about them. She had married Gerald Waldman, a dentist who practiced locally. They lived in a colonial home in the 3900 block of Sally Lane in Oceanside with their 3 young children, a daughter, Marla, and 2 sons, one of whom, Eric, was 5 years old. On the morning of Friday, January 11, 1974, Gerald left for work. The children left for school. Barbara was home alone. At approximately 9 o'clock in the morning, someone entered the Waldman home. The house was not broken into. There were no signs of forced entry. No shattered lock, no pried window, no evidence of violence at the point of access. Either the door was unlocked. Possible, in 1974, in a neighborhood that still felt safe enough for unlocked doors, or the person who entered was known to Barbara. Or the person who entered had been watching long enough to know her routines, the neighborhood's rhythms, which houses were occupied and when they were not. What happened inside the Waldman home on that January morning was an act of violence so specific, so deliberate, that Nassau County Police Commissioner Patrick Ryder would describe it 52 years later with barely contained fury. Barbara Waldman was found lying face down next to her bed, wearing her nightgown and bathrobe. Her hands were bound behind her back with her own pantyhose, which were also wrapped around her neck. She had been shot once in the back of the head. She was still in her nightclothes. It was 9 o'clock in the morning. Eric Waldman was 5 years old. He had ridden to kindergarten that morning on the school bus, sitting in a seat with his classmates, doing whatever 5-year-olds do on school buses in January. He came home for lunch, a routine. Children came home for lunch in 1974, walked through the front door and up the stairs and found his mother on the bedroom floor. "I've had the image of my mom in my head since I'm 5, Eric Waldman said at the press conference in 2026, now 57 years old. "And it won't go away until I die." 52 years of carrying that bedroom. 52 years of a 5-year-old's understanding of what he found, gradually growing into an adult's understanding, but the image always the same. Nassau County Police launched a homicide investigation immediately. They had physical evidence from the scene, biological material that indicated sexual assault. They had a crime scene without signs of forced entry, which told them something about the perpetrator's knowledge of the house or the neighborhood. They canvassed Sally Lane and the surrounding streets. They spoke to neighbors. They asked if anyone had seen anything unusual that morning, any car or person that didn't belong. Witnesses described a man near the Waldman home that morning. He was wearing a snorkel coat, the heavy, distinctively hooded jacket with a fur-trimmed opening that was fashionable in the early 1970s. From those descriptions, investigators produced a composite sketch. It was an accurate sketch. It captured the face of Thomas Generazio with what Nassau County investigators would later call, 52 years on, an almost perfect match. But in 1974, the sketch had no name beneath it. It was a face without an identity, circulated through a community that didn't recognize it as belonging to the sanitation worker who collected their trash every week. Generazio was never questioned. His name did not appear in the original 1974 case file. He was invisible, because he had the particular invisibility of someone familiar enough to blend into a neighborhood without standing out, while still knowing it well enough to move through it deliberately. And then, the second cruelty of this case arrived. Gerald Waldman, the dentist, the widower, the man who came home to find police in his house and his wife in a bedroom he would never enter the same way again. The man who was now raising 3 children alone, the youngest of whom had found their mother's body. Gerald Waldman became the subject of whispers. Not formal accusations. Not a police investigation that pointed toward him. The case file from 1974 contains no designation of Gerald as a suspect. Investigators cleared him. But the clearing of a husband in a murdered wife's case is institutional. It doesn't stop the informal machinery of a neighborhood's suspicion from running. And in Oceanside, quietly, the whispers ran. His daughter Marla grew up hearing them. "As children," she would say in 2026, "we heard many times that people were suspicious of my father, that he may have had something to do with my mom's murder." This powerful social mark of disgrace was heavy and hurtful to our family. Gerald Waldman went to work every day. He raised Marla and Eric and their brother. He was, by every account of his actual behavior, a man who bore an impossible situation with dignity. He never ran from the community that half suspected him. He stayed. He worked. He was a good father. He died without being publicly exonerated. He never knew who had killed his wife. In the decades that followed, the Waldman case periodically resurfaced. Nassau County Police never formally closed it. Marla Waldman grew into an adult who pushed. She asked questions. She met with investigators. She was not the kind of daughter who accepted silence. In 2024, after years of advocacy, she made a specific demand: She wanted the FBI involved. She wanted access to the most advanced DNA technology available. "I'm not letting this go," she told investigators. "It is not happening." The FBI eventually agreed to take the case. Working with Othram in Texas, the same laboratory that had sequenced the biological evidence in the Mary Theresa Simpson case, investigators submitted the biological evidence from the Waldman crime scene for advanced forensic genomic analysis. Othram extracted a DNA profile. The FBI's forensic genetic genealogy team built a family tree. The tree led to Thomas Generazio. Generazio had prior arrests for assault and possession of stolen mail, offenses that had never required a DNA sample at the time they occurred. He had no profile in any database. But his relatives did. And from those relatives, working outward through records and relationships, investigators built the case that pointed back to him. They confirmed the genetic hit in 2024. They exhumed Generazio's remains. They ran the comparison. The DNA from the Waldman crime scene matched the DNA from his grave. And then, separately, in a detail that is almost cinematic, Generazio's own daughter provided investigators with a photograph of her father. She had reached out to Marla Waldman, trying to understand what was happening, trying to make sense of what investigators were telling her about the man who had raised her. She sent the photograph. In the photograph, Generazio is wearing a coat with a fur-lined collar, strikingly similar to the one depicted in the 1974 police sketch. On March 11, 2026, Nassau County Police Commissioner Patrick Ryder and District Attorney Ann Donnelly stood before cameras. And Marla Waldman stood at the same podium and said the words her father never lived to hear. "After 3 difficult, life-changing years of putting this intricate puzzle together, I get to say to the world that our father, Jerry Waldman, is exonerated. He was a victim, not a villain." Generazio was 57 years old when he died. He had lived 30 years with the secret of what he had done on Sally Lane on a January morning in 1974. He had watched the Waldman children grow up in the community he worked in. He had taken out their trash, perhaps, on the mornings after he had murdered their mother. He believed he had gotten away with it. He was wrong. From Oceanside, we move east along the south shore to Lynbrook, and to a case that involves not one injustice but 4. A 16-year-old girl. 3 innocent men who served nearly 2 decades in prison for a crime they didn't commit. And a man who worked at a coffee truck and lived 1 mile from a roller rink and was never once looked at. For 40 years, until he threw a smoothie straw in the trash. Theresa Fusco. Theresa Fusco was 16 years old. She was a junior at East Rockaway High School, the kind of teenager who held a part-time job because she wanted to contribute, because she was built that way, responsible, present, committed. She worked the snack bar at Hot Skates, the roller rink on Sunrise Highway in Lynbrook, and she took that work seriously even when the work didn't warrant seriousness. On the evening of November 10, 1984, she was fired. The circumstances of why she was let go have never been fully elaborated in the public record, but the result was immediate and visceral. Witnesses saw Theresa leaving Hot Skates sometime before 10 p.m., in tears. Walking alone on a Long Island highway at 16, with nowhere specific she had told anyone she was going. She was never seen alive again. 3 weeks and 4 days later, on December 5, 1984, her body was found. She was buried under leaves in a wooded area a few blocks from the rink where she had worked. She was naked. She had been beaten, sexually assaulted, and lived with a ligature. Her killer had tried to hide her, the same instinct that had moved Alfred Murray to pile stones over Mary Theresa Simpson. The instinct of a person who knows what they have done and wants the world to forget it. The community around Lynbrook was shaken in the particular way that communities are shaken when a teenager is taken and lived, that specific combination of grief and fury and parental terror that turns into community pressure on law enforcement to find the person responsible. Quickly. Before another child is taken. Before the fear becomes permanent. Nassau County investigators worked the case through 1985 with that pressure at their backs. And in March 1985, it appeared to break. A 21-year-old local man named John Kogut was brought in for questioning. Kogut was young, inexperienced with the legal system, and frightened. The interrogation lasted 12 hours. Kogut later said, and investigators in wrongful conviction cases have documented this pattern across dozens of similar cases, that he told police what they wanted to hear because he was exhausted and terrified and believed that cooperation was his only path to getting out of that room. John Kogut confessed. In his confession, he implicated two other men, John Restivo and Dennis Halstead. He said that Restivo and Halstead had sexually assaulted Theresa, and that he had unalived her. In May 1986, John Kogut was convicted and sentenced to 31.5 years to life in prison. In November 1986, Dennis Halstead and John Restivo were convicted and each sentenced to 33 years and 4 months to life in prison. 3 men were going to prison for the murder of Theresa Fusco. None of them had committed it. The biological evidence from the crime scene, semen recovered from Theresa's body, preserved as part of the original investigation, did not match any of the 3 men. But the technology to determine this definitively did not exist in 1986. DNA profiling was in its infancy. The Nassau County Forensic Laboratory did not have the capability to make the comparison with the certainty required to exonerate. And so the convictions stood. Kogut, Restivo, and Halstead went to prison. They appealed. They maintained their innocence. They found lawyers who believed them. Eventually, lawyers from the Innocence Project, the organization founded specifically to use DNA evidence to identify and free wrongfully convicted individuals. And in 2003, after Kogut, Restivo, and Halstead had each served approximately 17 years in prison, DNA technology had advanced to the point where the comparison could be made definitively. The semen recovered from Theresa Fusco's body did not match any of the 3 convicted men. It matched someone else. Someone unidentified. An unknown male, whose DNA was placed in Cody's and generated no hit. The wrongful convictions of Kogut, Restivo, and Halstead were vacated. Charges were ultimately dismissed. Kogut was acquitted at a 2005 retrial. All 3 walked out of institutions where they had been held for crimes committed by someone else. Restivo and Halstead later sued Nassau County. A federal jury awarded them $18 million each. Their attorney at the time noted that the case proved intentional misconduct by the original investigating detectives. In August 2023, Nassau County investigators submitted the vaginal swab from the Fusco crime scene to a DNA laboratory in Houston, identified in court documents as a well-known forensic lab, widely understood to be Othram. Advanced genomic sequencing. A forensic profile extracted from 40-year-old biological evidence. The FBI's forensic genetic genealogy team built a family tree. The tree pointed to Richard Bilodeau. Investigators began a covert surveillance operation in February 2025. 4 months, they watched Bilodeau. They followed him through his daily routines, his errands, his outings in Center Mauritius, building a case, building certainty, waiting for a moment when he would discard something that carried his DNA in a way that could be collected legally and submitted for comparison. The moment came when Bilodeau walked into a tropical smoothie cafe. He ordered a drink. He sat. He finished it. He stood up, walked to the exit, and dropped the cup and straw in the trash on his way out the door. Investigators moved immediately. The cup was retrieved. The straw was collected into evidence with the care due a potentially case-closing artifact. The lab results came back. The DNA from that straw, Richard Bilodeau's DNA, District Attorney and Donnelly announced on October 15, 2025, was a match. A 100% match to the biological evidence preserved from the body of Theresa Fusco since December 5, 1984. On October 14, 2025, Bilodeau was arrested. He was arraigned the following day on 2 counts of second-degree murder and pleaded not guilty. He faces, if convicted, 25 years to life in prison. Theresa Fusco's father, Thomas, was in the courtroom for the arraignment. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small photograph of his daughter. He held it up. "I only loved her," he said. "And I miss her. She lives in my heart. I never gave up hope. I've always had faith in the system." His faith in the system is remarkable. The system had convicted 3 innocent men for his daughter's murder. It had taken 41 years to find the right one. And still, Thomas Fusco never stopped believing that eventually, someone would make it right. 3 men paid for what Bilodeau is charged with doing. They paid with decades. They cannot get those years back. What they have is exoneration, official acknowledgement of innocence, and money, which is what courts award when they cannot give back time. Theresa Fusco is still gone. Her father still carries her photograph in his jacket. But for the first time in 41 years, the right name is in front of a judge. Eve Wilkowitz. Eve Wilkowitz was 20 years old. She had a job she was proud of, a secretarial position at a publishing house in Manhattan, the kind of work that connected her to a world larger than the South Shore of Long Island, that made the commute worth it even when it ran late. The hours of New York publishing in 1980 were not the hours of the school day, and so Eve sometimes took the last train from Penn Station back to Bay Shore, back to her apartment, back to her routine. On the night of March 22, 1980, she boarded the 12:39 a.m. Long Island Railroad departure from Penn Station. She had made this particular commute dozens of times. She knew exactly which stop was hers, knew the walk from the Bay Shore station to her apartment, a short walk, through familiar streets, in a neighborhood she lived in and trusted. She stepped off the train. She began to walk. She was never seen alive again. 3 days later, on March 25, 1980, after Eve's boyfriend had reported her missing the morning after she disappeared, her body was found on the lawn of a home a short distance from her apartment. She had been sexually assaulted and Una lived. She was lying outside, on grass that was still cold from the March nights, as if whoever had done this had simply left her where they were finished. She was 20 years old. Suffolk County Police launched a full homicide investigation. They canvassed the neighborhood. They knocked on every door within a reasonable radius of where Eve's body was found. They collected biological evidence from the scene, the standard procedure for a crime of this nature. They interviewed neighbors. At some point during the canvass, officers spoke to a woman at a house nearby. She said she hadn't noticed anything. Her name was Mrs. Rice. Her son Herbert was not home at the time of the interview, or was not brought forward, or was simply not flagged as someone who warranted further attention. He wasn't. He slipped through. He had 3 prior minor criminal convictions on his record, offenses not serious enough in that era to compel a DNA sample. Without a DNA database, without forensic genealogy, without any technology that could link the biological evidence from the scene to a specific individual who had not already been identified as a suspect, the investigation had nowhere to go. The biological evidence from Eve's was preserved. The case stayed open. But without a suspect and without a forensic break, it gradually cooled. For Eve's younger sister Irene, the cooling of the investigation did not mean the cooling of the grief, or of the fear. Irene built her life in the years after Eve's murder. She became a mother, which she had always wanted. But she kept her dreams within a specific perimeter. Small. Safe. Because the man who had assaulted her sister was, as far as anyone knew, still out there. Still alive. Still living somewhere in proximity to the world Irene inhabited. My goal was to be a mom, Irene would say, decades later. And beyond that, I didn't allow myself to dream any other dream, because I was afraid someone would come along and murder me. That sentence, quiet, precise, devastating, is what an unsolved murder does to the living. It doesn't just take one person. It takes a piece of every person who loved them. It narrows every subsequent life into a space bounded by fear. The biological evidence sat in a Suffolk County evidence room, and the world moved toward a technology that none of these people could have predicted. In the early 2010s, millions of ordinary Americans began sending their saliva to companies like 23andMe and Ancestry DNA, spitting into plastic tubes and mailing them off to laboratories in search of health information, ancestry connections, lists of distant cousins they had never met. Most of them thought about this as a personal act. Genealogy. Identity. Curiosity. What none of them anticipated was that by voluntarily placing their genetic information in a commercial database, they were also, potentially, creating the investigative key that could unlock cold cases their relatives had committed. Herbert Rice's son was one of those people. He submitted his DNA to a genealogy website. He was simply trying to learn something about himself. In doing so, he handed investigators the thread that would unravel his father's 42-year secret. Suffolk County investigators, working with the FBI, submitted the preserved biological evidence through forensic genetic genealogy, the same technique used to identify the Golden State Killer in California in 2018. A DNA profile was built from the evidence. It was compared against consumer genealogy databases. A familial match was found, genetic material that shared enough of its signature with the crime scene evidence to indicate a relative. The relative was Herbert Rice's son. Investigators built a family tree. They worked outward from the son's profile, cross-referencing records and relationships, until they arrived at the father. Herbert Rice was 29 years old in March 1980. He lived with his mother, on the same street where Eve's body was found, just several doors down. He and his wife had recently separated, and Rice had moved back into his mother's house. He was displaced, living in close proximity to strangers, and that night, for reasons that would not be examined for 42 years, he was on that lawn. Herbert Rice died in 1991. He was 40 years old. He died of cancer. He died in Bay Shore, the same community where he had killed Eve Wilkowitz 11 years earlier. He died without confessing, without being questioned, without ever, as far as the public record shows, experiencing a single moment of legal consequence for what he had done on a March lawn in 1980. In March 2022, his grave was opened. DNA was extracted from his remains. It was compared to the biological evidence from the scene, evidence that had been sitting in a Suffolk County storage facility for 4 decades. The match was confirmed. On March 30, 2022, Suffolk County District Attorney Raymond Tierney stood before cameras and said what Irene Wilkowitz had been waiting 42 years to hear. "We have solved the murder of Eve Wilkowitz." Investigators showed Irene a photograph of Herbert Rice. For the first time in her life, she saw the face of the man who had narrowed her world down to just the things that felt safe enough to want. "This is my first time seeing him," she said, quietly. The last face Eve saw while she was still alive. She paused. "For 42 years, this was all I wanted. I just wanted it to be over." It was over.